Hello, my name is Hugo Guerraga and welcome to Hugo's Desk. This is the first of a series of video tutorials brought to you by BenQ and its professional monitors line. These Technicolor certified monitors are specifically tailored for the video production, design and photography market, providing creative professionals 4K resolution, 10-bit support, hardware calibration, dual view with separate color spaces, and many more features. Full reviews of both monitors are coming soon to Hugo's Desk. In the meantime, check them out at benq.com. For those of you that don't know me, I was born in Portugal and I'm a visual effects supervisor and director working in London. I've been working in the industry for 17 years. I have worked for the BBC, for Nexus, for The Mill, where I was the head of the Nuke Compositing department, and currently I'm a director and visual effects supervisor at Fire Without Smoke, working in trailers and cinematics for many AAA games. I've also been for the past 8 years a lecturer and keynote speaker for many events around the world, including FMX, End User Event, Visual Effects Festival, IBC, Visual Effects Society, The Trojan Horse, and Splash, among many others. Working closely with the Foundry, National Film Television School, Scape Studios, Campus I-12, and FX PhD. Today I start a brand new series of videos specifically created to help you transition from After Effects to Nuke. So this video is meant for anyone that knows After Effects already but wishes to either complement their visual effects knowledge or completely move to a node-based compositing application like Nuke. Taking advantage of BenQ's 4K monitor, I will be running After Effects and Nuke side by side, trying to achieve the same results in both applications. In this first video, we will do a small basic introduction to get you started before you watch more advanced videos on the series or even before you move to Nuke-only tutorials. We will be talking about the interface, project settings, how to import clips, playback, talk about layers versus nodes, merging two layers, talking about blending modes and exporting the composite. I will not go in depth on any of the above. This first video is meant to give you a jump start. So without further ado, let's get started.
On your left side, you have After Effects. On your right side, you have Nuke. Let's start by looking at the actual interface and its differences. You'll see that they're not as different as you might think. So in one way, you have in here, this is our viewer, and on the other side on Nuke, you have also a similar thing, which is a viewer as well. Down here on After Effects, as we all know, you have a timeline, and the corresponding thing to Nuke is not really a timeline. It's more like something called the node graph, which is where you will put all of your nodes and effects that you need to do on this project. And then of course also you have the curve editor, which will allow you to have curves for animation, and then you have the dope sheet. But the node graph is where most of the things happen. Then on this side here is what we call the properties bin. Now the properties bin at the moment is empty. At the same way on After Effects, you know that the properties show up in here. So let's start by setting up our project settings. That's always the most important thing on a project. Now, the project settings in After Effects, as you all know, are set up by a new composite. In After Effects, you have the settings for the resolution, which you have all these custom-made frame rates and, of course, the time code. Now, in Nuke, it's a bit different. It's not really called the compositing settings. It's a project settings, because in After Effects, you call it comp, but in Nuke, you call it a project or a script. Basically, you have to go into the edit section of Nuke, and then you have to go into project settings. When you press project settings in Nuke, you open up this, which is very similar to the one on After Effects. You can also have a frame range. Now, by default, usually it's a normal frame range because we haven't opened any footage yet. Then we have, of course, frames per second. Default is 24 because Nuke is mostly for film compositing. And then we have also, just like in After Effects, we have multiple presets of resolution. In this case, if we want 4K or if we want HD. So as you can see, these are the two places. Now let's move on to bringing in some footage. Now to bring in footage in After Effects, as we all know, you basically just have to go in here and say import file. Now I am opening up a sequence from a project that I did last year for Fire Without Smoke called The Crew, which was a CG trailer. I'm going to open up the final render so we can have a look at how it looked at the very end. So I'm going to open up version 20 here. I'm going to do the same thing in Nuke so you can see it at the same time. So in Nuke, it doesn't really work with importing. It's not called importing. In Nuke, there's a couple of ways of doing it. You can, of course, drag a clip into the to the node graph, just like you can do in After Effects as well. The difference is that in here, you have to go into this menu here. So these are the multiple effects you can have in Nuke. You see, you can have the read nodes, you can have every single node is categorized by different settings. So I'm going to go into the R, and you can see that it is called the read node. I'm going to click read. Now in Nuke, it is a bit different. As you can see, automatically it made it as a sequence. So in Nuke, it always represents itself as a sequence. You can see the hashtags, which is the number of frames that we have, and then you can see the sequences like that. If you look in here, down here, you have a button called sequences. If you press that button, you can now see it as frames, just like After Effects does. And you can even press this little very small button on this side, and if you open it up, you can see that you have even a preview per frames, so then you can actually only import one frame if you want to. As soon as I press open, just like on After Effects, you saw the settings down on the left, on your right you can see the settings of Nuke. So this is what we call a read node, and it's a node that gives you the path of where it is. It gives you the resolution of the original file. Then you have things like, if you want to set a proxy, you can also set the frame range, and you can select what color space you're bringing in the footage with as well. Now, one of the things that is different is that on After Effects, if I double click on the clip, you can immediately see that I can play it back. Now in Nuke, it doesn't really work the same way. If I click on the read node, it doesn't really do anything, because by default, Nuke always has something called the viewer. The viewer is a node as well, just like everything in Nuke. Everything is just nodes that you have to attach to one another. So if I now attach this input of the node into the read node, now if I play back, I can see that now it's playing back the clip. So now we have After Effects and Nuke running at the same time, side by side. Now, one thing you should know is that Nuke, by default, is always 32-bit float. That means that we have always a linear color space. In After Effects, that's not the case. In After Effects, it's always 8-bit by default, which you can see down here on this icon here. So if you press this button, you can clearly see that my project settings are now with depth of 8-bit per channel. So if I select here, if I wanted to match exactly what I'm doing in Nuke, I would have to change it to 32-bit float per channel. Now, in terms of the viewer controls, the two applications are very similar indeed. As you can see, this is my viewer of my project, and as I drag by frames, I can see that I can go backwards and forwards. Now, in Nuke, things are slightly different. Now you do have the play button and the stop button, and also of course you have the frame by frame, and you can go to the last frame or to the beginning frame. Now one thing is that in Nuke you always have default by frames. You can change this by going into here and change it to time code instead. So in After Effects it's exactly the opposite. It defaults to time code. But now that we had a little small idea of where things are and how to actually import the clip, now normally on a visual effects company you get all these passes. You get the depth passes, the diffuse filters, diffuse lighting, emissions, global illuminations. You can even check some of my tutorials on Hugo's desk to find out more how to use these passes in compositing. But in reality, this is why Nuke is so used for CG compositing, because it's so much more flexible for these kind of things. I'm going to actually show you how flexible this is. So for example, if I pick up this folder which has a multitude of different types of renders, if I drag it entirely into Nuke, I basically get a bunch of sequences. Now of course, if you want to view them, you don't really have to press the viewer and individually move them like this. You could literally just select the image you want to see and press 1, and then you can see it. So that's, for example, the main pass that has an alpha channel, and that's the main render from Redshift. Now let me show you in After Effects, and After Effects is a bit more tricky. Now I cannot just drag the folder, because if I drag the folder, it would only bring in one of the sequences. I'm going to, on the other hand, instead of doing that, I'm going to press import, and I'm going to select all my sequences. Then I'm going to not forget to go to the options and select multiple sequences. If I do that, then it will import not every single frame, but every sequence. If I press open, it now brought the same sequences. So if I press the main sequence and I play it back, you can see that I can play it back just like Nuke plays. Now one thing that we're missing is we're missing a background. So I'm going to bring in a background for Nuke. I'm going to bring all my backgrounds, And as you can see, same deal here. I have also my background. Now, if I want to merge these two images together, just like in Photoshop, After Effects, or anything that you have a lower layer and a top layer, I'm going to do it like this. So in After Effects, let's start with After Effects first. To make a comp, as you know, we can drag it into our composite. And this is my comp. So in After Effects, it's really easy that you can have a layer on the top and a layer on the bottom. Now let's do the same thing in Nuke. In Nuke, it is a little different. Like in Nuke, basically you have your background and then you have your foreground. Now, the way that it works is we're going to use what we call a merge node in Nuke. Now, we're going to go into the merge menu. Now, the way that it works is if I press the M button, you can see that I have what I called a merge node. Now, a merge node allows you to have an A and a B, which is A over B. So, and that's what the name it is. So B is always for background. Whatever you want on the background, that should be your B, and whatever is on the foreground is the A. And then of course on the side you also have a mask input as well. So the way that this works is that you basically would go ahead and put your background into your actual background and then your foreground into your foreground. Then if you want to view this, you can either switch the viewer to it, or you can, like I said, select that node, press 1, and then you're viewing the result of your composite. Now in here, if I now play back, I have exactly the same composite that I just did on After Effects. Nothing special here, but this is where After Effects and Nuke really are different. Now, on one hand, on After Effects, I can apply a specific special effect, like for example, brightness and contrast, which is the most common node that everyone uses. I'm going to go to brightness and contrast, bring in the car a bit more. I'm going to push the brightness down to the car, and I'm going to contrast the car a little bit more. Now, this, of course, as you all know, we have that as an effect. So now this is where things really become different. In Nuke, you would have done a very different way. You basically can clearly see that if I press the 1 button, first of all, because you're using a node-based compositing application, it's much faster to switch. So I can switch to just viewing this thing, I can switch to just viewing that thing, or I can switch to just viewing the final comp. Also, I'll automatically put a color correction node here. So let's say here that I go in here and I say, we're going to put a grade node on this side, and then we're going to put another grade node on the other side as well. Now, on this one here, I have a couple of options. Now, the way it works is that you have to double click on it to see it. Now, if I double click on both and I double click on every single thing, you can see that I start gathering a bunch of controllers. Now, these controllers, of course, can be switched off by pressing this button here. And you can limit how many controllers you can see by typing a different number over there. The way that it works, I'm not going to really go into detail of what black point, white point, lift, gain, multiply, and gamma is. You can check that on another tutorial from Hugo's desk later on. But if we do a bit of contrast, which would be slightly multiplication up, and then this is for the background. Of course, I'm going to lower the background a little bit and contrast it a bit. And then for the car, I'm going to push the car out a little bit as well. Now, you see now, this is the way that it works. So in After Effects, the same way when I'm actually looking at an effect like this, I can switch one of them off, the other one off. But here's the real advantage of having node compositing. Node compositing allows you to try a bunch of things. Not only you can try a bunch of things, but you can actually repeat and you can actually copy and you can actually have multiple versions. Let's say for a moment here that I have a client coming in and they don't like this version. So I've done this version. I thought it was cool, but they didn't thought it was cool. So I'm going to now select this entire thing. I'm going to paste it on this side, and you see that now I have another comp. Now on this comp here, let's say that I'm going to actually make my background much brighter and my contrast much lower, and then the car will be almost a silhouette. Let's imagine that. Now, of course, this is just for teaching purposes. As you saw, that was not what we did on the car. We did a lot more. This shot, of course, took several days. So now, as you can see, I have my first version, which was the car brighter and the background lighter, and I can actually play it back. And also, not only I have that version, but I also have this version here, which is exactly the opposite. Not only I can show my client on the fly the two versions, I can even press the 1 button for this merge node and the 2 button for this one and actually flip from one and the other immediately, so I can show the client what I'm doing. I can even do a wipe between them so that I can actually show the client exactly the differences that I have between. So as you can see, node-based compositing not only allows you to have multiple examples and allows you to work a bit faster, but it also is very open for experimentation. That's why I like it so much. And that's why I switched from After Effects to Fusion and to Shake and now to Nuke. Now let's say that the actual client is still not happy. Now, if they're not happy, I could literally just go in here and select and do yet another version. And I can now say, okay, we're not even going to do grade nodes. We're actually going to put a color corrector node in the background. And now I'm going to say, imagine the client says that they want to have a whole thing a bit more blue. So I'm going to tint the thing to blue. And then on the car, tint the car a bit more blue as well, but not as much as the background. I'm going to just tint a car a little blue, and now we have that version here. So as you can see, now we have version 1, which was, well, we have the normal version, which was the render that we've done. We then have, if I press number 2 on this merge node, I have the version that we first did. And then if I press number 3, I have then the new contrasted version. If I press number 4, I have the blue version. As you can see, the viewer has 1, 2, 3 inputs. And the reason I do that is because now I can easily tell my client to see version 1, version 2, version 3, or version 4. And as a click of a button, I can just show them multiple versions of the same thing. Now, not to say that I can't do this in After Effects, of course I can, but it would have meant that I would have had to do multiple nested comps. I would have to actually make multiple pre-comps and test things out that way. So let's go back to After Effects. Now I'm going to just bring in some flares so we can just put them in on top of the image so I can show you blending modes in Nuke. Now I just brought into After Effects 2 different things that we've made. Let's do this comp in After Effects. So I'm going to start by putting in my police lights. Of course, the police lights will need to be merged with a different blending mode, so I'm going to put them as an additive blending mode. I'm then going to put my lights. I'm going to put my background lights as well, which I will put on top below the police lights. I also, of course, have to put it as an additive color correction. Then I have my actual lights of the headlamps, which I'm going to put just on top of everything. And then again, I have to do additive as well for it to actually work. Now, as you can see, there's something going on here which is a bit weird. We'll go back to it in a minute. Now, inside of Nuke, I'll do exactly the same thing. First of all, I'm going to start by bringing in the footage that we need. Now, the way that it works, I'm just going to put Nuke in full screen so I can show you. The way that it works is that you usually merge more layers. So if you want to merge the same way, we're going to put first the police lights, and then we're going to merge the background, then we're going to merge the lights. You basically just use 3 nodes. So I'm going to merge the lights, and then I'm going to merge the other lights, and then I'm going to merge the other lights. The way that it works is that you start to make what they called a node graph, and it's a script. You start on the top and you go on the bottom. Now these need to be changed, of course, as an additive. So I'm going to change the merge node, the blending mode of the merge node. So you see here, my blending mode can be anything from what After Effects has or Photoshop has. In this case, I'm going to put a plus on my blending mode, and then I'm going to do the same thing to all the other blending modes as well. And this should now give me this image here. Now, this image here looks fine to me. So one of the cool things with having a node graph is that now, because I have this, I can see that that's my background, can even play it. That's my foreground. And then if I use the merge node, you can see that by pressing 1, I can see the full comp. Then I can go ahead and check this one, which is the lights on the car, which were done using optical flares on a 3D system in Nuke. Later on, I will do a video tutorial on Hugo's desk about this. And then you have the highlights and lights on the side, especially on the set. And then you have, of course, the headlamps. And of course, it doesn't really look like the final comp, because the final comp, of course, has depth of field. It has a bunch of really complex visual effects that we've done to the shot. But as you can see, this is, close enough. It's a starting point. Now, if I go into After Effects, you commence to see some of the issues. Now, After Effects by default doesn't really like very high dynamic images. When I say high dynamic images, just look at this lamp here. I'm just going to zoom into here as well and show you what I mean. So these lamps look similar, but for some reason on After Effects, it looks like it's slightly overexposed. Now, in After Effects, if I use my f-stop, I can lower it and you can see that it's all here. We can kind of see that all the dynamic range is still here. Now in Nuke, if I lower my f-stop, which is the top one, in Nuke you don't have just f-stop. You have the f-stop, which is this slider here. And then you have the gamma, which is this slider here as well. So they're very, very powerful for color correction. The gamma is great for you to see saturation of an image. And of course, the f-stop allows you to see dynamic range and luminance of an image, so which is really powerful. So you see, if I lower, they look exactly the same. And so we have a match. Now, if I press the f-stop to go back, and if I press this f-stop to go back, you see that there's something different. This image looks much brighter than that image. Now, the reason this is happening is because the calculation of linear color space in Nuke, the mathematical calculation, is slightly different from After Effects. Now, there's ways, of course, of fixing this. You could have went to your project settings, and in color settings, you could have told them to blend all the colors using gamma of 1. If I do that, the blending will be matching the same blending that I had in Nuke. And so now, even if I lower, I can still see the same image. If you don't do this, you cannot see the dynamic range. The same thing as well, if you now change your comp to 8-bit, you can clearly see the dynamic range was completely lost. And so Nuke doesn't really have the same thing. I can't really show you an 8-bit comp, but in After Effects, if I switch from 8-bit to 16, or to 32. So if I switch to 8-bit, you have a full clamped image. If I switch to 32, I have all the dynamic range like in Nuke. I'm going to switch back to 32-bit float. I'm also going to save. It's always good to save. And there you have it. As you can see, we have successfully comped the same thing, exactly the same thing on both After Effects and Nuke. You can clearly see, though, by playing it back now, Nuke immediately showed me the comp. And After Effects is still struggling to playing it back. One of the reasons this is happening is because After Effects is really not optimized to float 32-bit float, and Nuke is completely optimized to 32-bit because it never switches from 8-bit to 16 to 32. It always works in 32. So that's one of the advantages, and that's why Nuke is also used in production so much more in visual effects for hardcore visual effects. If you're just using motion graphics, then you should stick with After Effects, but if you want to do hardcore visual effects, Nuke is a much better option. Now, one last thing, of course, let's just render our fantastic comps. So, of course, in After Effects, there's no mystery. It's quite easy. As you all know, we just basically go into our comp, add to render queue. So I'm going to do a quick time. I want to use ProRes HQ, and then I'm going to press OK. So that's a quick time. I'm going to save, and then I'm going to press render. That's done now. I go to my desktop. I should have a quick time of the comp that I've just made. So that's the QuickTime that we've just created. Now in Nuke, slightly different approach. You would have to, just like anything in Nuke is a node. So the same way that you saw a node called the read node, right below it you have one called the write node, which is a W. You can see that you have a node called the write node. So at any moment I can just save just this if I want to, or I can render the whole comp. So I'm going to put it on the bottom of my comp. I'm now going to double click, say that I want to save it on my desktop. I'm going to call this Nuke. I'm going to press save automatically because I told him that it's a .move. It's going to pick up ProRes 444. That's the default. I'm going to change it to 422. Now if I want, I now can press the render button, press on, and now it's going to start rendering, and that's done. And so now, if I go to my desktop, I have the Nuke render and I have the After Effects render. From the top and the bottom, they look exactly the same. They're exactly the same render Now, of course, this video was a bit too long, I know, I'm afraid, but there's a lot more to tackle and to show you. This, for me, is just a little introduction of how you should start tackling a project in Nuke. And it's basically, I wanted to make this side-by-side view because I think it is one of the best ways for you to kind of understand how Nuke works and how After Effects works. And I know we haven't went through everything, of course not. Nuke takes months to understand where the buttons are, and it takes years to master. I've been using Nuke for 10 years. But on later tutorials, I'm sure that we are going to tackle different parts of this, and I'm sure you're going to have a much better understanding of how this works.
And that was it for today. Sorry for the long tutorial, but there was a lot to talk about. I hope you've enjoyed this first video. A follow-up will come shortly in the next few weeks. If you want, check out some of my videos at Hugo's Desk, where every month we will have new videos about visual effects, Nuke, gaming, and technology. And thank you so much for watching.